Why smart people make the worst decisions under pressure. The hidden psychology of high-stakes failure. Introduction. When intelligence becomes a liability. There is a seductive story we tell ourselves about intelligence. In this story, intelligence is the great equalizer, the master key that unlocks any lock, the compass that never points in the wrong direction. We celebrate it in our institutions, reward it in our hiring decisions, and defer to it in our moments of uncertainty. When something goes wrong, our instinct is to find where the intelligence was lacking and supply more of it. This story is, at best, incomplete. At worst, it is dangerously misleading. The research on decision-making under pressure tells a more complicated and ultimately more useful story. It tells us that intelligence, particularly the kind of intelligence we formally measure, the kind that earns high scores on standardized tests and makes people fluent in the language of abstraction, is highly context-dependent in its benefits. In low-pressure environments with clear rules, good information, and adequate time for reflection, higher intelligence is generally associated with better decision outcomes. But as pressure increases, as information becomes ambiguous, as time compresses and emotional stakes rise, the advantage conferred by high intelligence begins to erode, and in some cases reverses entirely. This is not a minor finding buried in an obscure journal. It is a pattern that has been replicated across domains as diverse as finance, medicine, military strategy, disaster response, and organizational leadership. It has been documented by researchers at institutions including Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, the Rand Corporation, and the United States military's own research divisions. It has been observed in laboratory simulations, in archival analyses of real-world disasters, and in the lived experience of practitioners who have spent careers navigating high-stakes environments. And yet it remains one of the most under-discussed ideas in our cultural conversation about success, leadership, and decision quality. The intelligence paradox defined. To understand why smart people make the worst decisions under pressure, we must first understand what intelligence actually is, and what it is not. Intelligence, in its most commonly measured form, reflects a cluster of cognitive abilities: working memory capacity, processing speed, pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and verbal fluency. These abilities are genuinely valuable. They allow their possessors to learn faster, solve novel problems more effectively, and navigate complex information environments with greater ease than those with lower scores on these dimensions. But these same abilities come bundled with a set of cognitive tendencies that are not always beneficial, and that become actively harmful under pressure. Chief among them are an elevated capacity for rationalization, the ability to construct compelling post hoc justifications for decisions already made on emotional or intuitive grounds, a stronger susceptibility to overconfidence in domains of expertise, a greater facility with constructing complex causal narratives that may be internally coherent but externally false, and a stronger identity investment in being right. Under normal conditions, these tendencies are held in check by adequate time for reflection, by the corrective feedback of others, by the natural humility that comes from encountering the limits of one's knowledge. Under pressure, when time is short, information is scarce, stakes are high, and the emotional temperature of the environment is elevated, these corrective mechanisms fail. And what remains is the raw intelligence, now unmoored from its usual guardrails, operating in service of decisions that may be brilliant in their internal logic and catastrophic in their external consequences. Who this book is for? This book is written for anyone who operates in high-stakes environments and wants to understand the specific ways their intelligence might be working against them. It is for the executive who has watched a promising strategy collapse despite everyone in the room being convinced it would succeed. It is for the physician who has made a confident diagnosis that later proved wrong. It is for the military officer, the emergency manager, the financial analyst, the policymaker, and the entrepreneur who have all, at some point, experienced the particular humiliation of making a terrible decision in exactly the moment when they were most confident in their judgment. It is also, more broadly, For anyone who wants to develop what the ancient Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom, the capacity to make good decisions not just in the abstract but in the messy, pressured, emotionally charged conditions that characterize real life. The chapters that follow move through the problem systematically. We begin with the architecture of smart thinking itself, examining what intelligence actually consists of and how it normally functions to produce good outcomes. We then trace what happens to that architecture under conditions of pressure, fear, and uncertainty. We examine specific failure modes, overconfidence, analysis paralysis, emotional hijacking, the expert's curse, groupthink, each of which is amplified by intelligence. We look at extended case studies of brilliant failure. And we end with a practical framework for making better decisions when the stakes are highest. Throughout, the goal is not to celebrate stupidity or to suggest that intelligence is a burden. The goal is something more precise and more useful, to illuminate the specific conditions under which intelligence fails, so that intelligent people can recognize those conditions and respond to them wisely. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Smart Thinking. To understand how intelligence fails under pressure, we must first understand what intelligence looks like when it is working well. This requires us to go beneath the common myths about smart thinking, the image of the lone genius whose brilliance erupts spontaneously, fully formed, and examine the actual cognitive machinery that produces what we recognize as intelligent behavior. The dual process framework. Modern cognitive science has converged on a broadly useful framework for understanding human thought, the distinction between two fundamentally different modes of processing. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman, building on decades of research by himself and Amos Tversky, popularized this distinction as System 1 and System 2 thinking, though the underlying ideas have roots going back much further in cognitive psychology. System 1 is fast, automatic, and largely unconscious. It operates through pattern recognition, heuristics, and emotional signals. It is the system that allows you to read a face and instantly know that something is wrong, that allows an experienced chess player to see a promising move without consciously analyzing all alternatives, that allows a seasoned firefighter to sense that a building is about to collapse without being able to explain exactly how they know. System 1 is not irrational. It is, in fact, a tremendously powerful form of intelligence, one that has been refined over evolutionary timescales and refined further through years of individual experience. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and conscious. It is the system that engages when you solve a difficult math problem, when you read a complex contract, when you carefully weigh the pros and cons of a major decision. System 2 requires effort and attention, and it has limited capacity. We cannot sustain it indefinitely, and its performance degrades under conditions of fatigue, stress, and cognitive load. Intelligent behavior, in most circumstances, involves a sophisticated interplay between these two systems. The expert clinician uses System 1 to rapidly generate diagnostic hypotheses based on pattern recognition, and System 2 to consciously evaluate those hypotheses against evidence and rule out alternatives. The experienced investor uses System 1 to identify promising opportunities and System 2 to rigorously stress test the thesis before committing capital. The wise leader uses System 1 to sense the emotional climate of a room and System 2 to craft a response that is both emotionally resonant and strategically sound. What makes high intelligence thinking distinctive? People who score high on conventional measures of intelligence tend to differ from their peers in several specific ways that are relevant to decision making. First, they have larger working memory capacity. Working memory is the cognitive workspace where we hold and manipulate information in real time. Greater working memory capacity means the ability to hold more variables in mind simultaneously, to consider more complex chains of causation, to track more competing hypotheses at once. This is clearly advantageous in many decision contexts. It means being able to model situations of greater complexity without losing track of important elements. Second, high intelligence individuals tend to have faster and more efficient pattern recognition. They identify structural similarities between situations more quickly, apply learned frameworks from one domain to another more readily, and extract signal from noise more efficiently. This too is a genuine advantage. It is the cognitive foundation of what we call expertise and wisdom. Third, high-intelligence individuals tend to have greater facility with abstract reasoning, the ability to reason about hypothetical scenarios, to think in terms of principles rather than specific instances, to manipulate symbols and structures that have no direct sensory referent. This enables them to think ahead, to model futures that don't yet exist, to reason about complex systems with many interacting parts. Fourth, and this is where the story starts to become complicated, high-intelligence individuals tend to have greater capacity for what psychologists call motivated reasoning. They are better at constructing arguments in support of conclusions they have already reached, better at finding flaws in evidence that contradicts their position, and better at generating alternative explanations that preserve their existing beliefs. This capacity, as we shall see, is both a strength and a profound vulnerability. The role of expertise. Separate from raw intelligence, though often correlated with it, is expertise, the domain-specific knowledge and skill that accumulates through years of deliberate practice and experience. Expertise, like intelligence, is genuinely valuable and genuinely dangerous. The cognitive scientist Anders Ericsson spent decades studying expertise and its development. His research established that what distinguishes experts from novices is not simply having more information, but having that information organized in more sophisticated patterns, what cognitive scientists call schemas or mental models. The chess grandmaster does not see individual pieces, they see patterns of threat and opportunity that are invisible to the novice. The master physician does not see a list of symptoms, they see a clinical picture that instantly narrows the diagnostic space. These organized mental models are enormously powerful. They allow experts to perceive structure in apparent chaos, to respond appropriately to complex situations far faster than conscious deliberation would permit, to make good decisions with limited information by filling in gaps from experience. They are, in a real sense, the distillation of thousands of hours of learning into instantly accessible perceptual cognitive tools. But they are also the source of some of the most characteristic errors that experts make under pressure. Mental models that have been built up over years of experience in one context may be systematically misleading when applied in a context that looks similar but differs in critical ways. The confidence that expertise generates, the feeling of having seen this before, of knowing how this goes, can be just as high in cases where the situation is deceptively novel as in cases where it truly matches past experience. And because experts have invested years of their lives in developing their expertise, they are emotionally committed to their models in ways that make it difficult to update them even in the face of contradicting evidence. Intelligence and metacognition. One of the supposed advantages of higher intelligence is greater metacognitive capacity, the ability to think about one's own thinking, to monitor one's own cognitive processes, to recognize when one is making an error. And it is true that, on average, higher intelligence individuals perform somewhat better on explicit metacognitive tasks in laboratory settings. But this advantage is smaller than intuition suggests, highly domain-specific, and especially vulnerable to the conditions of high pressure. When we are under stress, our metacognitive monitoring becomes less accurate precisely because the cognitive resources it requires are being consumed by the demands of the stressful situation itself. We become less able to notice that we are making assumptions, less able to recognize when our confidence exceeds our competence, less able to step back from the immediate pressure of the situation and evaluate our own reasoning from the outside. The cruel irony is that intelligent people, who in calm circumstances often do show superior metacognitive awareness, may be more susceptible to this degradation under pressure, because they are accustomed to trusting their own cognition, have less practice doubting themselves, and have more elaborate justificatory structures available to rationalize whatever conclusions their pressured minds arrive at. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Intelligence is real, it is valuable, and it is also, under the specific conditions of high pressure and high stakes, a system with known failure modes that are made more dangerous, not less, by the very capacities that make intelligent people exceptional. Chapter 2. What pressure actually does to the brain. We use the word pressure casually, as a metaphor borrowed from physics. We speak of being under pressure the way we speak of being underwater, as if it were simply a matter of external force being applied to an otherwise unchanged system. But this metaphor is misleading in an important way. Pressure does not simply add a weight to an otherwise normal mind. It fundamentally reorganizes the mind's functioning, changing not just what we can do but how we do it, what information we attend to, what goals we pursue, and what cognitive tools we have access to. To understand why smart people fail under pressure, we need to understand what pressure actually does to the brain, at the level of neurobiology, at the level of cognitive architecture, and at the level of behavior. The stress response. A brief biology. When we encounter a situation we perceive as threatening, our brains initiate a cascade of neurobiological events that have been conserved across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, rapidly assesses incoming sensory information for signals of danger. When it detects such signals, it triggers the release of stress hormones, primarily adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, through the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. These hormones have immediate and profound effects on virtually every system in the body. Heart rate increases to pump more blood to muscles. Breathing accelerates to increase oxygen availability. Non-essential processes, digestion, immune function, long-term planning, are deprioritized. Attention narrows dramatically, focusing on the immediate threat at the expense of peripheral information. Glucose is mobilized for rapid energy availability. This system, what we commonly call the fight or flight response, is magnificently adapted for its original evolutionary purpose, surviving acute physical threats. When a predator is charging, you do not need broad attention, nuanced deliberation, or complex social reasoning. You need fast, powerful, automatic action. The problem, which is both well documented and poorly appreciated in its implications, is that this same system is activated by the psychological pressures of modern high-stakes decision environments, by tight deadlines, by the threat of professional failure, by public scrutiny, by the fear of letting people down, and its effects on cognition are just as profound as they are in response to physical threat, but dramatically less useful in contexts where the challenge is intellectual rather than physical. How stress impairs higher cognition. The specific cognitive effects of stress have been extensively studied, and they are worth examining in some detail because they map precisely onto the capabilities that intelligent people most rely on, and most believe they retain even when under pressure. Working memory, which we identified in the previous chapter as a key component of high-intelligence cognition, is exquisitely sensitive to stress. Research by Sean Beilock and colleagues at the University of Chicago demonstrated that working memory capacity, which normally predicts performance on complex tasks, actually becomes a liability under conditions of high pressure. In their studies of math performance under evaluation threat, individuals with the highest working memory capacity showed the greatest performance decrements under pressure. The mechanism appears to involve intrusive thoughts, worries about performance, self-evaluation, social judgment, that consume working memory resources that would otherwise be available for the task itself. In other words, the bigger your working memory, the more of it gets consumed by anxiety-driven rumination when you are under pressure, and the less of it remains available for the actual problem you are trying to solve. Prefrontal cortex functioning, which underlies most of what we think of as rational deliberation, planning, impulse control, perspective taking, the ability to hold multiple competing hypotheses in mind and evaluate them, is directly impaired by elevated cortisol. The neuroscientist Amy Arnstein's work at Yale has documented the mechanisms by which even moderate stress levels cause measurable degradation in prefrontal function, shifting control of behavior toward more automatic, habitual, and emotionally reactive systems. Under moderate stress, we become, in a precisely describable neurobiological sense, less rational. Attention narrows under pressure in ways that are both adaptive and maladaptive depending on the situation. Tunnel vision, the focusing of attention on the most immediately salient aspects of a situation at the expense of peripheral information, can be valuable when the threat is simple and the relevant information is near the center of the attentional field. In complex decision environments where critical information is distributed across multiple channels and where the relevant cues may not be the most salient ones, tunnel vision is actively dangerous. It causes decision makers to miss information that would challenge their initial assessment, to over-attend to confirming evidence, and to fail to notice that the situation has changed in ways that make their existing plan obsolete. Memory retrieval is also impaired by acute stress in ways that are counterintuitive. While emotional memories are often enhanced and made more vivid by stress, which is why we remember where we were on September 11th with unusual clarity, the controlled, deliberate retrieval of specific information from long-term memory is impaired. Experts under severe pressure may find themselves unable to recall information they know perfectly well in calm circumstances. This is the neurobiological basis of the phenomenon that soldiers, pilots, and surgeons call choking, the failure, at the critical moment, to access skills and knowledge that are demonstrably present. The cognitive load problem. Beyond the direct neurobiological effects of stress, pressure creates a cognitive load problem that specifically undermines the kinds of complex, multi-step reasoning that intelligent people excel at. High-pressure situations are typically characterized not just by the threat of negative outcomes but by complexity, many variables to track, many stakeholders with competing interests, many possible courses of action with uncertain downstream consequences, and simultaneous demands on attention and cognitive resources from multiple directions. This complexity creates cognitive load, the demand placed on working memory and conscious processing capacity. The challenge is that cognitive load and stress interact in a multiplicative rather than additive way. Under conditions of high cognitive load, individuals show the same patterns of impaired performance typically associated with stress. Under conditions of stress, cognitive load capacity is reduced. When both are present simultaneously, as they typically are in genuine high-stakes crises, the combined effect on decision quality can be dramatic. For intelligent people, this creates a specific trap. Their confidence in their cognitive capacity, justified in ordinary circumstances by their track record of handling complex problems, leads them to take on more cognitive load than they can sustain under pressure. They attempt to track more variables, model more contingencies, and maintain more complex situational awareness than the stressed brain can actually support. The result is a kind of cognitive overreach. The attempt to apply full capacity intelligence to a situation in which that full capacity is not available, resulting in errors that are invisible to the decision maker because the very cognitive resources needed to detect them are themselves impaired. Time pressure and decision quality. A specific and enormously consequential form of pressure in high-stakes decision environments is time pressure, the sense that a decision must be made now, that the window for action is closing, that delay is itself a form of failure. Time pressure affects decision quality in multiple ways. It reduces the amount of information that can be gathered and processed before a decision must be made. It increases the reliance on heuristics and intuitive processes, which, as we will discuss at length, can be both powerful and systematically biased. It increases the likelihood that decision makers will choose the first option that meets a minimum threshold of acceptability, rather than choose the best available option from among all those considered. For intelligent people, time pressure interacts with their characteristic cognitive style in ways that are particularly problematic. Intelligent people, accustomed to their ability to think through complex problems thoroughly, are especially likely to be frustrated and disoriented by time pressure, and thus especially likely to experience it as an additional stressor that further degrades cognitive performance. They may also be more likely to resist the natural simplifying move of satisficing and instead attempt to maintain the comprehensive analytical approach that works in unconstrained conditions, consuming additional cognitive resources in a doomed attempt to sustain full deliberative quality under conditions where it is not possible. The feeling of clarity. Perhaps the most dangerous effect of pressure on intelligent minds is one that gets very little attention: the subjective feeling of clarity and confidence that often accompanies stress-induced cognitive narrowing. When attention narrows under pressure, when the cognitive field contracts to a single dominant interpretation of the situation, the subjective experience is not one of having a limited or impoverished view. It is one of having finally cut through the complexity and noise to see what is really going on. The very narrowing of perspective that constitutes a cognitive impairment feels, from the inside, like clarity. The tunnel vision that causes decision makers to miss critical information feels like focused insight. The oversimplification that results from reduced cognitive capacity feels like incisive analysis. This is why pressure-induced errors are so difficult to catch in real time, and so shocking in retrospect. The intelligent people who make them are not experiencing a sense of doubt or confusion, they are experiencing a sense of confident understanding. The catastrophically wrong decision feels, in the moment of making it, like exactly the right call. Chapter 3. The Overconfidence Trap. Of all the cognitive failure modes that afflict intelligent people under pressure, overconfidence is perhaps the most pervasive, the most studied, and the most consistently underestimated in its real-world consequences. It is a phenomenon so deeply embedded in the cognitive architecture of high-achieving individuals that it functions less like an occasional error and more like a structural feature of the intelligent mind, one that serves important purposes in conditions of low pressure and becomes catastrophically dangerous in conditions of high pressure. The nature of overconfidence. Overconfidence is not a single phenomenon but a family of related biases. The most commonly studied form is calibration overconfidence, the tendency to have more certainty in one's judgments than is warranted by actual accuracy. When people who are overconfident in this way say they are 90% sure of something, they are actually right roughly 70% of the time. Their subjective confidence exceeds their objective accuracy by a systematic margin. A second form is the better-than-average effect, the tendency to rate one's own abilities, judgment, and performance as above average in domains where above-average performance is valued. Studies consistently find that 70–90% of people rate themselves as above-average drivers, above-average leaders, above-average decision-makers. This is, of course, mathematically impossible. By definition, only 50% of people can be above average. The better-than-average effect is not simply a reflection of self-promotion or social desirability. It reflects a genuine cognitive bias in how we assess our own capacities relative to others. A third form is planning fallacy overconfidence, the systematic underestimation of how long tasks will take, how much they will cost, and how many obstacles they will encounter. This form of overconfidence is particularly consequential in organizational and strategic decision contexts, where it leads to the chronic failure of projects, the underallocation of resources, and the underestimation of risk. All three forms of overconfidence are documented with extraordinary consistency across cultures, professions, and demographic groups. And all three forms are, on average, stronger in people with higher levels of education and expertise, which is to say, in exactly the people who are typically placed in positions of leadership and responsibility in high-stakes organizations. Why intelligent people are more overconfident? The relationship between intelligence and overconfidence is not simple, and it has been a subject of active research and debate. The naive prediction might be that more intelligent people would be better calibrated, that their superior ability to process information and model their own cognitive processes would result in more accurate self-assessment. This prediction turns out to be wrong in most real-world domains. Several mechanisms explain why intelligent people tend toward greater overconfidence. First, intelligent people have more experience of being right. Over years and decades, their superior cognitive capacity has genuinely produced better outcomes than their peers in most situations. This creates a well-founded, experience-based confidence in their judgment, which then generalizes beyond the situations where it is appropriate. The intelligent executive who has correctly called 20 market trends in a row has genuine evidence for confidence in their market judgment. But that evidence does not justify equal confidence in their judgment about organizational culture, operational details, or the emotional dynamics of their team, domains where they may have very different track records. Second, intelligent people are better at constructing justifications for their positions. When confronted with evidence that challenges a confident judgment, the average person may simply feel confused or uncertain. The intelligent person constructs a sophisticated alternative explanation for the discrepant evidence, an explanation that preserves their original judgment while appearing to account for the contradicting data. This capacity for motivated reasoning allows intelligent people to maintain confidence in positions that a less sophisticated thinker would have abandoned, and it does so in a way that feels entirely rational from the inside. Third, intelligent people inhabit social environments, elite universities, selective organizations, high-achieving professional communities, that provide unusually strong positive reinforcement for confident self-presentation. In these environments, expressing uncertainty is often penalized. It signals weakness, indecisiveness, or incompetence. Expressing confident, decisive judgment is rewarded with respect, influence, and advancement. Over years of operating in these environments, intelligent people develop a conditioned association between confident expression and social success, an association that makes it increasingly difficult to recognize or acknowledge genuine uncertainty, even when they privately feel it. Overconfidence and risk. The consequences of overconfidence are particularly severe when they interact with risk assessment. In high-pressure decision environments, accurate assessment of risk, of the probability and magnitude of potential negative outcomes, is critical for making good decisions. Overconfidence systematically distorts this assessment in ways that lead decision-makers to take on more risk than is actually justified. Overconfident decision-makers underestimate the probability of adverse outcomes. They construct optimistic models of how their plans will unfold and apply insufficient weight to the possibility that their models are wrong. They underestimate the number of things that can go wrong, the independence of potential failure modes, and the ability of the system to recover from failures when they do occur. They also underestimate what the former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld famously called unknown unknowns, the risks that arise not from factors you have failed to estimate correctly, but from factors you have not even considered. In complex systems, unknown unknowns are often more consequential than known risks, and they are by definition invisible to the decision maker. Overconfidence in one's model of the situation, the conviction that one has identified all the relevant variables, leaves intelligent decision makers especially vulnerable to the risks they have not thought to look for. The Dunning-Kruger nuance. A widespread misunderstanding in discussions of overconfidence involves the Dunning-Kruger effect, a finding from psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger at Cornell University. The Dunning-Kruger effect is often summarized as the claim that unintelligent people are more confident than intelligent people, that the incompetent don't know they're incompetent, while the competent are burdened with self-doubt. This summary, while containing a kernel of truth, fundamentally misrepresents the research in ways that are relevant to our subject. What Dunning and Kruger actually found was more nuanced. Beginners in a domain, people with minimal knowledge and skill, are often poor at assessing their own ability, leading to overconfidence in some, but not all, domains. As people develop genuine competence, their self-assessment tends to become more accurate. But experts, people at the high end of the competence distribution, often show overconfidence again, though through different mechanisms. They are no longer overconfident about what they know, but about the limits of what they know and about the transferability of their expertise to adjacent domains. This matters for our purposes because the Dunning-Kruger effect has been misappropriated to provide false reassurance to intelligent people. If only the incompetent are overconfident, then surely the intelligent and expert are well calibrated. But the actual research, including work by Dunning himself, is clear that expert overconfidence is a real and consequential phenomenon, different in character from novice overconfidence, but no less dangerous, and arguably more so because it operates at the level of real-world decisions that actually matter. Overconfidence under pressure. All of this would be concerning enough if overconfidence were a stable trait that simply characterized some proportion of intelligent people's decision-making. But the relationship between pressure and overconfidence makes the picture significantly worse. Under pressure, overconfidence typically increases rather than decreases. Facing a high-stakes decision with an approaching deadline, intelligent people do not typically respond by becoming more reflective about the limits of their judgment. They respond by becoming more certain, by consolidating around a single interpretation of the situation, by increasing their commitment to their existing plans and assessments, and by becoming less responsive to information that might suggest a need to revise. The mechanism behind this pattern is partly neurobiological. Stress hormones reduce prefrontal activity, which is associated with reflective self-monitoring, and increase the influence of automatic, pattern-matching processes, which feel certain and do not generate the same subjective sense of doubt. But it is also partly functional. Under time pressure and threat, the capacity for genuine uncertainty is experienced as a liability. The intelligent mind, detecting that a decision must be made and that wavering will make it harder, suppresses the signal of uncertainty in favor of the commitment that decisive action requires. The result is a decision-making process that is confident, decisive, and increasingly untethered from an accurate assessment of what is actually known. This is not stupidity. It is intelligent cognition operating under conditions for which it was not designed, and producing outcomes that are, precisely for that reason, all the more catastrophic. Chapter 4. Analysis Paralysis and the Cost of Knowing Too Much. If overconfidence is the failure mode of the decisive intelligent mind, analysis paralysis is the failure mode of the reflective one. Where the overconfident decision-maker plunges ahead with excessive certainty, the analytically paralyzed one is unable to act at all. Caught in an endless loop of information gathering, model refinement, and scenario analysis that consumes the time and attention needed for timely action. Both patterns represent the failure of intelligence under pressure. They differ only in which aspect of intelligence has been turned against the decision-maker. The nature of analysis paralysis. Analysis paralysis occurs when the capacity for analytical thought, the ability to identify complexity, model uncertainty, and anticipate second and third order consequences, overwhelms the capacity for decision and action. It is characterized by the inability to settle on a course of action despite adequate information, by the continuous generation of new considerations that postpone closure, and by an escalating sense of anxiety as time passes and the decision remains unmade. It is important to distinguish analysis paralysis from appropriate deliberation. In many situations, taking additional time to gather information and refine one's analysis does produce better outcomes. The problem is not careful thinking per se. It is the failure of careful thinking to generate timely decisions, which is most acute precisely in the high-pressure situations where timely decisions matter most. Intelligent people are particularly susceptible to analysis paralysis for several reasons that connect directly to the cognitive capacities that make them intelligent. The curse of knowing what you don't know. One of the markers of genuine expertise and intelligence is the capacity to recognize the limits of one's knowledge, to know what you don't know, in Rumsfeld's formulation. Novices in a domain are often blissfully unaware of the complexity lurking beneath the surface of their problems. Experts have had this illusion shattered. They know that what looks simple often isn't, that easy answers are frequently wrong, that the relevant information is often more ambiguous than it first appears. This epistemological sophistication, this awareness of complexity and uncertainty, is genuinely valuable in many decision contexts. But under pressure, it becomes a liability. The intelligent decision-maker who is acutely aware of everything they don't know, of every consideration that has not yet been fully evaluated, of every scenario that hasn't been modeled, this person is not in a position to make a confident decision. They are in a position to make an anxious, hedged, provisional one, or no decision at all. The less intelligent decision-maker, blissfully unaware of the complexity they're missing, may actually perform better in time-pressured situations. Not because their analysis is better, but because their ignorance of what they don't know allows them to act with a confidence that, while not fully warranted, is sufficient to produce timely action. This is one of the clearest examples of how intelligence becomes a liability under pressure. The very capacity that allows intelligent people to model situations more accurately, to see more of what is actually there, also makes them more aware of the uncertainty that remains, and this awareness, in high-pressure situations with tight time constraints, prevents the decisive action that the situation requires. Option proliferation. A related mechanism is what decision scientists call option proliferation, the generation of more possible courses of action than can be effectively evaluated within the available time. Intelligent people, by virtue of their greater capacity for abstract reasoning and their broader knowledge base, are typically able to generate more possible responses to any given situation than less intelligent people. In unconstrained decision environments, this is advantageous. More options means a greater likelihood that one of them is optimal. But in time-constrained environments, which is to say, in most genuinely high-pressure decision situations, the proliferation of options is actively harmful. Research on decision-making consistently shows that beyond a certain threshold, more options do not lead to better decisions but to worse ones, a phenomenon the psychologist Barry Schwartz has called the paradox of choice. As the number of options increases beyond what can be thoroughly evaluated, decision quality declines and decision time increases. Decision makers become overwhelmed, engage in less systematic evaluation, and often end up either paralyzed or making arbitrary choices that are no better than chance. For intelligent people generating large numbers of options under pressure, this paradox is particularly acute. Their intelligence generates the options. Their awareness of uncertainty makes them reluctant to dismiss any of them prematurely. Their analytical capability generates reasons why each might be appropriate in some scenario, and the result is a decision space so large and so thoroughly populated with plausible alternatives that the selection of any single course of action feels arbitrary and premature. The perfect enemy of the good. At the heart of analysis paralysis is a deep and often unarticulated assumption that more information will reduce uncertainty to the point where a confident decision becomes possible. This assumption is wrong in most high-stakes decision environments, and the failure to recognize that it is wrong is a characteristic failure of intelligent minds under pressure. In genuinely complex, dynamic, and uncertain environments, the kind of environments where the most consequential decisions are made, more information rarely eliminates uncertainty. It typically reveals more of its complexity. Each new piece of data opens up new questions. Each model refinement reveals new parameters whose values are uncertain. Each scenario analysis generates new scenarios that hadn't previously been considered. The intelligent decision maker who is waiting for their analysis to converge on a clear answer may wait indefinitely. The practical wisdom, the phronesis that the ancient Greeks held as the highest cognitive virtue, consists not in perfect analysis but in the ability to make good enough decisions with the information available, in the time available, at the time when those decisions need to be made. This kind of wisdom is not captured by conventional measures of intelligence. It is a skill that must be separately cultivated, and it runs against the cognitive grain of people who have been rewarded throughout their lives for the thoroughness and rigor of their analysis. Pressure and paralysis. A vicious cycle. The interaction between pressure and analysis paralysis creates a particularly vicious cycle. As the stakes of a decision rise and the time available to make it shrinks, the analytically minded intelligent person typically responds by intensifying their analytical effort, gathering more information, running more scenarios, consulting more experts. This intensification of effort consumes time and attention, increasing time pressure further. The increased time pressure raises the stakes of the decision. Now there is not only the risk of making the wrong choice but the risk of having made it too late, which in turn intensifies the analytical response. The cycle continues until either the opportunity for decision has passed entirely, or the decision maker collapses into an arbitrary choice made in panic rather than judgment. Breaking this cycle requires the cultivation of what might be called decision courage, the ability to make a commitment to a course of action in the face of genuine uncertainty, with the explicit acknowledgement that the decision may turn out to be wrong, and with the readiness to adapt when it does. This is not recklessness. It is the recognition that in time-sensitive, high-stakes situations, the cost of inaction is itself a form of risk, often a larger risk than the cost of an imperfect decision made in time. Chapter 5. Emotional hijacking in high IQ minds. The popular conception of intelligent people, particularly of the most intellectual, analytical variety, tends to minimize the role of emotion in their decision-making. We imagine the brilliant analyst at their desk, coolly evaluating evidence, the elite executive in the boardroom, rationally weighing alternatives, the expert clinician at the bedside, methodically working through a differential diagnosis. In these images, emotion is at best irrelevant and at worst an interference to be suppressed. This conception is profoundly mistaken, and the consequences of acting on it are severe. Emotion is not an optional add-on to human cognition that can be turned off or minimized in moments when clear thinking is required. It is woven into the very fabric of cognitive processing. It is part of how we perceive situations, assign meaning to information, evaluate options, and motivate action. Intelligent people are as emotionally shaped in their decision-making as anyone else. And under pressure, their emotional responses can hijack their vaunted analytical capacities in ways that are invisible from the inside. The neuroscience of emotion and decision. The research of Antonio Damasio and colleagues at the University of Iowa and subsequently at USC fundamentally changed our understanding of the relationship between emotion and rational decision-making. Studying patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region that integrates emotional processing with higher cognition, Damasio found that they retained intact intellectual abilities in laboratory testing while showing catastrophically impaired judgment in real-world decision contexts. These patients could not make good decisions about everyday choices, financial matters, or social situations, not because they lacked intelligence or information, but because they lacked the emotional signals that normally guide the direction and weighting of rational analysis. They could generate options, evaluate them analytically, and identify potential consequences, but without emotional responses to those consequences, they could not determine which option to choose. Deliberation became endless, choices became arbitrary. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis, the proposal that emotion-related body signals mark options as good or bad, hot or cold, safe or dangerous, and thereby guide decision-making, has been extensively validated and refined in subsequent research. Its implications for our subject are profound. Rational decision-making does not operate independently of emotion. It is partly constituted by it. Emotional processing is not an interference with good judgment, it is part of good judgment. But the same system that makes emotional processing essential to good decision-making also makes it a source of systematic distortion. Emotional signals that developed in one context may misfire in a different one. Emotions generated by irrelevant features of a situation, the fear triggered by the memory of a past failure that superficially resembles the current one, the anger triggered by a perceived slight during a negotiation, can flood the decision-making system with signals that have nothing to do with the actual decision at hand. How intelligent people experience emotional hijacking. For intelligent people, emotional hijacking under pressure takes several characteristic forms. The first is rationalized emotion, the use of analytical capacity to generate post hoc justifications for emotionally driven conclusions. The intelligent executive who feels fear at the thought of a strategic pivot does not experience their resistance to the pivot as fear, they experience it as reasoned skepticism. Their intelligence obligingly generates a long list of substantive objections to the pivot that feel analytically compelling but are actually scaffolding constructed around an emotional core that their conscious mind has not acknowledged. This is motivated reasoning in its most sophisticated form. The rational apparatus in full service of the emotional response, producing outputs that are indistinguishable from genuine analysis. The second form is emotional suppression and its costs. Many intelligent people, particularly those in professional cultures that valorize rationality and emotional stoicism, learn to suppress their emotional responses in high-stakes situations. They develop the ability to appear calm, analytical, and decisive even when experiencing intense fear, anger, or grief internally. This capacity for emotional regulation is genuinely valuable in some ways. It allows sustained performance under conditions that would incapacitate less regulated individuals. But emotional suppression does not eliminate emotional influence on decision-making. Research by James Gross at Stanford has shown that suppression, the active inhibition of emotional expression, requires cognitive effort, consumes working memory resources, and impairs cognition in ways that are not visible either to the suppressor or to observers. The intelligent leader who suppresses their fear to project confidence in a crisis may be doing so at the cost of precisely the cognitive capacity they need to navigate that crisis effectively. The third form is emotional contagion, the automatic, largely unconscious adoption of the emotional states of others in one's environment. In high-pressure group decision environments, the crisis war room, the emergency management center, the surgical suite in a disaster, the emotional climate of the group becomes a powerful force on individual decision-making. Intelligent people are not immune to emotional contagion. In fact, their greater attunement to social and emotional signals may make them more susceptible to it. The collective panic or collective overconfidence of a room can sweep even the most analytically rigorous individual into decision patterns they would never exhibit in isolation. The specific emotions of high-stakes failure. Several specific emotions are particularly consequential in the context of high-pressure decision-making by intelligent people. Fear, most obviously, is both the most common emotional accompaniment of high-stakes decisions and the one whose effects are most studied. Fear under pressure promotes risk aversion in some circumstances and risk-seeking in others, a seeming paradox that is resolved by the prospect theory of Kahneman and Tversky, which shows that the reference point of gains versus losses is more important than the absolute value of outcomes in determining risk preferences. People who are already experiencing losses, or who perceive themselves as failing, become risk-seeking, willing to take gambles they would normally reject in pursuit of recovering their position. This pattern, doubling down in the face of failure, is one of the most reliable precursors to catastrophic outcomes in financial, military, and organizational decision contexts. Pride and the fear of humiliation are equally powerful and less often discussed. For intelligent people whose identity is closely tied to being right, being knowledgeable, and being in control, the threat of public failure activates powerful defensive emotional responses. These responses motivate the maintenance of positions that should be abandoned, the dismissal of evidence that should be taken seriously, and the persecution of subordinates or colleagues who are attempting to deliver unwelcome truths. The catastrophic decisions that result are not made in the service of the organization's goals, they are made in the service of the decision-maker's emotional need to not be wrong. Hope, perhaps counterintuitively, can also be a source of decision failure. The emotion of hope, the positive expectation that things will work out, can sustain effort and resilience in the face of adversity. But it can also generate what the management scholar Isabel Royer has called organizational hope, the collective, emotionally sustained belief in the eventual success of a failing project that prevents the timely decision to cut losses. Smart people who are emotionally invested in a course of action they believe in will sustain that investment long past the point where the evidence justifies it, because the emotional reward of continuing to believe exceeds the intellectual cost of acknowledging failure. Chapter 6. The Expert's Curse. There is a particular quality of error that only experts can make, a class of mistakes that is unavailable to beginners precisely because it requires the deep, richly organized knowledge structures that expertise provides. We might call it the expert's curse, the tendency for the very knowledge and experience that constitute expertise to become, in certain circumstances, a source of systematic bias and perceptual blindness. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the intelligence pressure problem, because it challenges the deeply held belief that more knowledge and experience always produce better decisions. In the domain of one's expertise, under conditions of adequate time and information, this belief is generally correct. But under pressure, in novel situations, or at the boundary of familiar domains, expertise can actively mislead. The structure of expert mental models. Expert mental models, the organized knowledge structures that allow experts to perceive situations in their domain with speed, depth, and efficiency, are built through thousands of hours of experience. They represent the distillation of a career's worth of pattern recognition into a set of perceptual cognitive tools that can be applied rapidly and almost automatically. The power of these models is real and impressive. The radiologist who has read 30,000 chest X-rays can detect a subtle shadow that a medical student will miss entirely. The master chess player who has studied 50,000 positions can see tactical threats and strategic opportunities that are invisible to the intermediate player. The experienced structural engineer who has designed hundreds of bridges can look at a schematic and immediately identify the critical load-bearing elements that are most vulnerable to failure. But these models are built on past experience, and they encode the patterns of the past. When the current situation fits those patterns, expert mental models are powerful guides to action. When the current situation deviates from past patterns in ways that are not immediately perceptible, when it looks like the familiar cases but differs from them in crucial, less visible ways, expert mental models can actively mislead. The Einstellung effect. The Einstellung effect, from the German word for set, or attitude, is a well-documented phenomenon in which expertise leads to the application of habitual solutions to new problems, even when those solutions are inappropriate. Named after early research in problem-solving psychology, it has been observed in domains ranging from chess to medical diagnosis to military planning. The mechanism is straightforward. When an expert encounters a situation that superficially resembles familiar patterns, the familiar patterns are automatically activated. This automatic activation is so strong that it can actually prevent the expert from recognizing novel features of the situation, features that, if noticed, would indicate that a different approach is required. The expert literally sees the familiar pattern rather than the actual situation, because their perceptual system has been trained to extract that pattern from situations like this one. Under pressure, the Einstellung effect is dramatically amplified. Time pressure reduces the opportunity for careful examination of the current situation against the template of the activated pattern. Stress reduces the cognitive resources available for noticing discrepancies between expectation and reality. The emotional confidence generated by the activation of a familiar pattern, the feeling of, "I've seen this before, I know what to do," is heightened, making the expert even less likely to stop and question whether the pattern truly fits. The expert's curse, in this form, manifests as a paradoxical reversal of the normal expertise premium. In certain high-pressure situations, the expert performs worse than the novice, not despite their knowledge and experience, but because of it. Expertise and the illusion of familiarity. A related but distinct failure mode involves what we might call the illusion of familiarity, the expert's tendency to perceive a novel situation as familiar even when it is not. This is not the same as the Einstellung effect, which involves the application of a habitual solution. The illusion of familiarity is a deeper perceptual distortion. The expert does not merely apply the wrong solution to the right problem, but fails to perceive that the problem is new at all. Novel situations, situations that have no close precedent in the expert's experience, are especially dangerous in high-pressure contexts precisely because experts are less well equipped to recognize them as novel. Their pattern recognition machinery, optimized to identify instances of familiar types, generates a sense of recognition even when the current situation differs in important ways from the familiar pattern. The emotional response to apparent familiarity, the reduction in anxiety, the increase in confidence, actively suppresses the attention to detail that might reveal the discrepancy. This mechanism is well documented in military history. where experienced commanders have repeatedly mistaken novel tactical situations for familiar ones, with catastrophic results. It is equally well documented in medicine, where experienced physicians have misdiagnosed unusual presentations of rare conditions as common conditions they superficially resemble. It is a regular feature of financial crises, where experienced investors have classified unprecedented market configurations as just another version of a cycle they have navigated before. The narrow slice problem. Expertise also creates what might be called the narrow slice problem, the tendency to make judgments about situations in one's domain of expertise while unconsciously assuming that the relevant variables are only those within that domain. The experienced finance executive who sees a troubled company thinks in terms of capital structure, cash flow, and market positioning, the variables their expertise equips them to analyze. They may systematically underweight or entirely miss variables that fall outside their domain. The organizational culture problems that are driving staff turnover, the regulatory changes that are about to reshape the competitive landscape, the technological developments that are making their business model obsolete. Not because they are unintelligent. They may be brilliant, but because their expertise has shaped their attention to focus on certain kinds of variables and trained them to extract signal from noise in those dimensions. Under pressure, this narrow slice problem is amplified. Cognitive load reduction drives attention further toward the familiar, the well-modeled, and the domain central. The cross-domain, interdisciplinary, or novel considerations that a genuinely comprehensive analysis would include are the first casualties of the cognitive narrowing that pressure produces. The expert mind, under pressure, becomes an even more specialized instrument, and specialized instruments, however powerful, have limited ranges of application. Chapter 7. Social Dynamics: How Smart Groups Make Stupid Choices. The failures we have examined so far are, at their core, failures of individual cognition. But the most consequential decisions in high-stakes environments are rarely made by individuals alone. They are made by groups. Boards of directors, military command staffs, surgical teams, crisis management committees, investment committees, policy advisory councils. And groups, it turns out, are not simply aggregations of individual minds whose strengths add together and whose weaknesses cancel out. Groups have their own dynamics, their own pathologies, and their own characteristic failure modes that are dramatically worsened when the group is composed of highly intelligent, high-achieving individuals. The myth of collective wisdom. There is genuine evidence for the wisdom of crowds in certain specific conditions, when individual judgments are independent, when diversity of perspective is preserved, and when aggregation mechanisms are functioning properly. Under these conditions, the average of many independent judgments can outperform any individual judgment, even expert ones. But these conditions are rarely present in the high-pressure group decision environments that we are concerned with. The members of a crisis management committee are not independent. They share information, they share assumptions, they share institutional culture, and they share the social dynamics of the group. The diversity of perspective that characterizes truly heterogeneous crowds is often absent from the homogeneous elite groups that make critical decisions. And the aggregation mechanism, the way the group synthesizes its members' views into a collective decision, is typically not a systematic statistical process but a social one, dominated by status, authority, and the dynamics of interpersonal influence. In these conditions, the wisdom of crowds does not emerge. What emerges instead is a set of social dynamics that can produce collective decisions that are worse than what any individual member of the group would have made in isolation. Groupthink. The classic account. The psychologist Irving Janis introduced the concept of groupthink in 1972. Following his analysis of several major American foreign policy disasters, including the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failure to anticipate the Pearl Harbor attack, and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Janis observed that these disasters were not failures of individual intelligence or information access. The decision-makers involved were, in many cases, extraordinarily capable individuals with access to extensive information. They were failures of group process. Failures produced by the social dynamics of cohesive, insular groups making decisions under pressure. Janice identified several characteristic symptoms of groupthink. The illusion of invulnerability, shared by all group members, that encourages excessive optimism and extreme risk-taking. Collective rationalization, through which group members discount warnings and other adverse information. Unquestioned belief in the morality of the group's objectives. Stereotyped views of outgroups as weak, evil, or stupid. Pressure on any member who expresses dissent. Self-censorship by members aware of their deviation from the apparent group consensus. The illusion of unanimity produced by this self-censorship, and the emergence of self-appointed mindguards who protect the group from disturbing information. The conditions that Janice identified as promoting groupthink are precisely the conditions that characterize high-pressure decision environments. High group cohesion, isolation from external perspectives, directive leadership that signals preferred outcomes, high stress with few opportunities for alternative information, and the absence of systematic procedures for considering alternatives. Status and the suppression of dissent. In groups composed of highly intelligent, high-achieving individuals, a specific dynamic compounds the groupthink problem, the interaction between status hierarchies and the social pressure for consensus. In any group, individuals differ in their perceived expertise, authority, and social status. These differences shape whose views are attended to, whose objections are taken seriously, and whose silence is interpreted as agreement. In elite groups, the kinds of groups that make consequential decisions in high-pressure environments, status differences tend to be both large and highly salient. The four-star general, the Nobel laureate, the senior partner with 30 years of firm-specific experience, their status signals are unambiguous, and their influence on group deliberation is enormous. The result is that group deliberation in elite settings rarely represents the genuine pooling of all available knowledge and perspective. It represents the hierarchically weighted aggregation of views, in which the perspectives of high-status members are overrepresented and the perspectives of lower-status members, who may have direct knowledge of crucial operational realities that high-status members lack, are systematically underweighted or entirely suppressed. Lower-status members in these groups face a genuine dilemma when their knowledge or judgment conflicts with the apparent consensus of their higher-status colleagues. Voicing dissent risks social sanction, being perceived as disloyal, naive, or insufficiently confident in the group's capacity. Remaining silent feels safe but means that critical information or objections go unheard. In practice, under pressure and with the additional urgency of a looming decision, the path of least resistance is silence. And the group proceeds with a decision that is confidently based on an information set from which critical inputs have been silently withheld. Cascade effects and herding. A related phenomenon in group decision-making is the information cascade, the process by which early expressions of preference or judgment from high-status individuals cause subsequent members to update their publicly expressed views in the direction of the apparent consensus, regardless of their private assessment. The mechanism is rational at the individual level but catastrophic at the group level. If you are the fifth person to express a view in a group where the first four have all said the same thing, it is rational, in a narrow sense, to give some weight to their apparent convergence. Perhaps they know something you don't. Perhaps your private reservations are based on a misunderstanding. The rational response to a strong apparent consensus is to update one's confidence in one's private assessment downward. But if the first four people also suppressed their private reservations and went along with the apparent consensus of the people before them, then the cascade of agreement does not actually represent four independent data points. It represents one initial signal, perhaps itself made under duress or insufficient information, propagated and amplified through the social dynamics of the group. The apparent consensus is a mirage constructed entirely from the social pressure for agreement, containing no more actual information than the first individual's tentative assessment. Under pressure, information cascades happen faster and more completely. The urgency to reach a decision and proceed to action truncates the deliberative process that might otherwise allow private reservations to surface. The emotional contagion effects we discussed earlier spread the apparent confidence of the high-status advocates through the group. And the result is a collective commitment to a course of action that, in calmer conditions with genuine deliberation, the group would never have endorsed. Chapter 8. The role of identity in catastrophic decisions. Among the factors that make intelligent people particularly prone to catastrophic decisions under pressure, one of the most powerful and least discussed is identity. Specifically, the identity that intelligent, high-achieving people typically construct around their intelligence and judgment. The self-concept of being someone who understands things, who makes good decisions, who is not easily fooled, becomes, under pressure, a powerful force that distorts their cognition in ways they are exquisitely positioned not to notice. The high-stakes identity of the expert decision-maker. The people who occupy positions of leadership and responsibility in high-stakes organizations have typically arrived there through a long process of demonstrated excellence. They have been repeatedly selected, at every stage of their career, for the quality of their judgment, the rigor of their analysis, and the reliability of their performance. Their position in the hierarchy is, in a real sense, a testimony to their decision-making quality. This history creates a strong and deeply held identity. I am the person who gets this right. I am the person whose judgment is trusted. I am the person who has been selected for this role precisely because I am better at this than others. This identity is not mere vanity. It is a genuine self-concept that has been forged through years of experience and validated by demonstrable results. But it is also a source of systematic bias. When one's core identity is organized around being right, being knowledgeable, and being competent, the threat of being wrong, especially in a high-visibility, high-stakes situation, is not merely an inconvenience. It is an existential threat. It threatens not just the outcome of the immediate situation but the self-concept that has been built over a career. The response to existential threat is predictable: defense. The cognitive and emotional resources of the intelligent decision-maker are mobilized not toward the accurate assessment of the situation, but toward the defense of the identity at stake. Information that contradicts their assessment is discounted or explained away. People who express dissent are perceived as not understanding, not being in full possession of the relevant facts, or being motivated by personal agendas. The elaborate analytical apparatus of the intelligent mind is deployed in service of a predetermined conclusion, the conclusion that they are right. Commitment and escalation. One of the most reliably documented consequences of identity investment in decisions is escalation of commitment, the tendency to increase investment in a failing course of action rather than acknowledge that the original decision was wrong. This phenomenon, sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy in its individual form and Concord syndrome in its organizational form, is one of the most costly patterns in organizational and personal decision-making. Escalation of commitment has been extensively studied since Barry Staw's seminal work in the 1970s. The research converges on a consistent set of findings. The people most likely to escalate commitment to a failing course of action are those who are most responsible for the original decision, most identified with the project, and most concerned with self-justification. These are, almost by definition, the senior, high-status, intelligent decision-makers who bear the most responsibility for major organizational commitments. The mechanism involves both the identity factors we have discussed and a specific cognitive bias, the tendency to weight sunk costs, resources already spent and unrecoverable, as though they were relevant to the forward-looking decision of whether to continue. Rationally, sunk costs are irrelevant. What matters for the decision to continue or stop is the expected future return relative to the expected future cost. But emotionally, abandoning a project means making permanent the losses already incurred. Continuing offers the possibility, however slim, of recovering those losses. And for a decision-maker whose identity is invested in the success of the project, the emotional cost of acknowledgement of failure is added to the rational calculus, tipping the balance toward continuation long past the point where it is defensible on the merits. The ego defense architecture. Intelligent people have at their disposal a particularly elaborate set of ego defense mechanisms, cognitive strategies for protecting the self-concept from threatening information. These mechanisms are not unique to intelligent people, but intelligent people deploy them with greater sophistication, rendering them both more effective in the short term and more dangerous in the long term. Intellectualization, the use of abstract, detached analysis to avoid engaging with the emotional or personal significance of threatening information, is especially common in highly analytical individuals. The executive who responds to evidence of a strategy's failure with an elaborate technical reanalysis of the market data, rather than with an honest acknowledgement that the strategy was built on incorrect assumptions, is intellectualizing. The physician who responds to a patient's death with a clinical post-mortem focused on procedural minutiae, rather than with an honest examination of their diagnostic error, is intellectualizing. The political leader who responds to policy failure with sophisticated rationalizations about implementation challenges, rather than with a fundamental reconsideration of the policy's premises, is intellectualizing. Projection, attributing one's own failings to others, is another commonly deployed defense. The intelligent leader who made a bad call under pressure may become increasingly convinced that the failure was caused by the incompetence, disloyalty, or sabotage of subordinates. This conviction is often not entirely without basis. In complex organizations, failures almost always have multiple contributing causes. But the intelligent mind's ability to construct compelling causal narratives means that it can produce extraordinarily convincing accounts of others' culpability that systematically underweight the decision-maker's own contribution. Facing the mirror. Identity and learning. The tragedy of identity-driven decision failure is not just the immediate cost of the bad decisions it produces. It is also the cost to learning. Organizations and individuals can only improve their decision-making by accurately diagnosing their failures, by honestly asking what went wrong, what assumptions were incorrect, and what different choices might have produced better outcomes. This requires exactly what identity protection prevents: the willingness to look honestly at one's own contribution to failure. The intelligent people who are most at risk of the failure modes described in this chapter are also, because of their intelligence, among the most capable of generating elaborate alternative explanations for their failures that preserve their self-assessment. Their intelligence is genuinely in service of the protection of their identity, and the result is that the very experiences that should produce the deepest learning produce the least, because the learning requires a confrontation with the self that the intelligent mind is uniquely well equipped to avoid. Chapter 9. Case Studies in Brilliant Failure. Theory is clarified by example, and the patterns we have traced through the preceding chapters, overconfidence, analysis paralysis, emotional hijacking, the expert's curse, groupthink, identity defense, are brought into sharpest relief when we examine them at work in specific historical cases. The cases below are chosen not because they are the most dramatic examples of failure available, but because they illustrate with particular clarity the role of intelligence, the intelligence of the people involved, in producing the outcomes they did. These were not failures of incompetence. They were failures of competence under pressure. The Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, 2003. On the morning of February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart over the southern United States during re-entry, killing all 7 crew members aboard. The physical cause of the disaster was known almost immediately: a briefcase-sized chunk of insulating foam that had broken off the external tank during launch 16 days earlier had struck the leading edge of the left wing, damaging the thermal protection tiles. During re-entry, superheated plasma penetrated the damaged wing structure, causing the orbiter to disintegrate. What makes the Columbia disaster relevant to our subject is not the physical cause but the human cause, the decision-making process at NASA that allowed the shuttle to attempt re-entry with known damage to its heat shield. This was not a case of ignorance. NASA engineers and analysts were aware of the foam strike within hours of the launch. What followed was a case study in nearly every failure mode we have examined. The NASA management team at the time of Columbia was not incompetent. They were, by any conventional measure, highly capable professionals. But they operated within an institutional culture that had profound structural biases, a culture that had historically punished the raising of safety concerns that were perceived as threatening to schedule, a culture in which the pressure to maintain launch cadence had gradually normalized the risk of foam strikes, and a culture in which the most senior decision-makers were largely insulated from the engineering-level concerns of those who knew the most about the shuttle's thermal protection system. During the 16 days of Columbia's mission, engineers at the debris assessment team and within contractor organizations raised concerns about the potential severity of the foam damage and requested satellite imagery to assess it more accurately. These requests were denied at the management level on the grounds that even if damage was confirmed, there was nothing that could be done, a conclusion that subsequent investigation showed to be incorrect. The logic of the management decision was, "We cannot fix it, so we should not look at it." Underneath this logic was the operation of several of the failure modes we have examined. First, overconfidence based on prior experience. Foam strikes had occurred on previous missions without catastrophic outcome, leading to the normalization of the risk and the confident assumption that this strike, like the others, was manageable. Second, identity investment in the mission schedule and institutional momentum. Diverting the mission, delaying the landing, or acknowledging a potentially fatal flaw would have been enormously costly institutionally, and the intelligence of the management team was deployed in service of finding reasons why it was not necessary. Third, the suppression of dissent through status dynamics. The concerns of engineers lower in the hierarchy were filtered and attenuated as they passed upward through management layers, arriving at the decision-making level stripped of their urgency and technical specificity. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's report was unusually frank in its assessment of the human and organizational factors. It concluded that the technical cause of the disaster was the foam strike, but the underlying cause was the organizational culture of NASA, a culture that had systematically degraded the safety decision-making processes that should have caught and corrected the error before it became fatal. The 2008 financial crisis, brilliance at scale. The 2008 global financial crisis is sometimes described as a failure of greed or of regulation. It was both of those things. But it was also, at its cognitive core, a failure of intelligence under pressure, specifically, the failure of some of the most sophisticated financial minds in the world to correctly assess the risks embedded in the instruments they were creating, selling, and holding. The financial instruments at the center of the crisis, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, were not simple. They were complex, mathematically sophisticated structures that required considerable analytical capability to understand. The people who created and managed them were not financial naifs. They were, in many cases, people with advanced degrees in mathematics, physics, and engineering who had applied their considerable intellectual resources to the problem of financial engineering. Several of the failure modes we have discussed were operating at scale in the financial system leading up to 2008. The experts' curse manifested in the collective failure of financial professionals to recognize that the risk models they were using had been calibrated on historical data from a period that did not include a nationwide decline in housing prices, an event that the models therefore assigned near zero probability. The sophisticated quantitative frameworks that characterized the expertise of leading financial professionals provided a false sense of having understood and managed the risk, when in fact they had only modeled it in ways that excluded the most consequential scenarios. Groupthink and information cascades operated at the institutional level. When major institutions including ratings agencies, investment banks, and regulators all converged on the assessment that the new instruments were sound, each institution's confidence in this assessment was reinforced by the convergence of others. The information cascade was not limited to a single organization but spanned the entire financial ecosystem, creating a system-wide illusion of consensus that suppressed the few dissenting voices. People like Michael Burry, Steve Eisman, and others who recognized the risk but were dismissed by the mainstream as contrarians who didn't understand how the new financial system worked. Identity and escalation of commitment played major roles in the crisis as it developed. As early warning signs appeared, rising delinquency rates, declining origination standards, early defaults in lower quality tranches, the institutions most heavily invested in the mortgage market responded not by reducing exposure but by increasing it. The analytical sophistication of their risk teams was deployed in constructing increasingly elaborate justifications for maintained confidence, and the identity of the institutions as leaders in the market for these products made acknowledgement of fundamental error extremely costly from a reputational standpoint. Theranos. Intelligence, charisma, and catastrophic overconfidence. The case of Theranos, the company founded by Elizabeth Holmes in 2003 with the aim of revolutionizing blood diagnostics, offers a somewhat different perspective on the intelligence pressure-failure nexus, because in this case the pressure was not external crisis but self-generated ambition, and the failure mode was overconfidence combined with the ruthless suppression of dissent. Holmes was, by most accounts, a highly intelligent and extraordinarily charismatic individual who genuinely believed in the revolutionary potential of her company's technology. The board of Theranos, which included former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, and other eminences from politics and business, was composed of individuals whose distinguished careers were evidence of their capability. And yet this assembly of intelligent, experienced people collectively participated in the maintenance of a fraud that endangered the health of thousands of patients and cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars. The failure at Theranos illustrates several failure modes in combination. Holmes's personal overconfidence, her conviction that the technology would work, even as evidence mounted that it did not, was sustained and amplified by the identity she had constructed as a visionary disruptor. Acknowledging the technical limitations of the technology would have meant abandoning an identity that had become the central organizing principle of her existence. The resulting motivated reasoning was extreme. She and her inner circle constructed elaborate explanations for why the evidence of failure was not what it appeared to be, why critics were motivated by self-interest or fear of disruption, and why success was always just around the corner. The board's failure was a failure of the elite group dynamics we discussed in the previous chapter. Board members were selected for their prestige rather than their technical knowledge of medical diagnostics or laboratory science. They were therefore unable to independently assess the technical claims being made and were dependent on Holmes's representations. The social dynamics of an elite board, the deference to the visionary founder, the reluctance to express skepticism that might be perceived as not understanding the vision, the status dynamics that made challenging the dominant narrative costly, suppressed the questions that should have been asked far earlier than they were. The charge of the Light Brigade, military intelligence failure. Moving to an older case to illustrate the historical depth of these patterns, the charge of the Light Brigade on October 25, 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, is perhaps the most celebrated example of catastrophic military decision-making in the English-speaking world. 673 men of the British Light Cavalry Brigade were ordered to charge directly into the batteries of Russian artillery, a suicidal attack that resulted in over 40% casualties in under 30 minutes. The military commanders involved, the Earl of Cardigan commanding the brigade, the Earl of Lucan commanding the cavalry division, and Lord Raglan commanding the British Expeditionary Force, were not unintelligent men. They were experienced military professionals with extensive records of service. What produced the disaster was a failure of communication under pressure, compounded by the status dynamics of the command hierarchy and the identity investments of the individuals involved. Raglan's order, transmitted by a staff officer who was killed before he could clarify its meaning, was ambiguous. In the chaos and pressure of an active battle, with the urgency of responding to a perceived immediate threat, Lucan and Cardigan interpreted it in the worst possible way, and the status dynamics of the command hierarchy meant that the obvious questions, which guns? What valley? This doesn't make tactical sense, were either not asked or not answered. Pride and identity played their roles. Cardigan's famous stubbornness and his bitter rivalry with Lucan made rational deliberation between the two commanders nearly impossible. The order was followed, and the brigade was destroyed. What makes this case instructive is not its uniqueness but its typicality. The combination of time pressure, ambiguous information, status-driven communication failures, and identity-motivated stubbornness that produced the charge is recognizable across centuries and domains. The specific content of the catastrophe differs. The cognitive and social dynamics that produced it are the same ones we have been examining throughout this book. Chapter 10. Breaking the Pattern, Decision Wisdom Under Pressure. The preceding 9 chapters have been a sustained examination of how intelligence fails under pressure. The picture is, if honest, a somewhat disheartening one. The very cognitive strengths that distinguish intelligent people, their pattern recognition, their analytical depth, their capacity for complex modeling, their confidence in their own judgment, are the specific capacities that become liabilities in high-pressure decision environments. The question that remains is what to do about it. The answer is not to become less intelligent, obviously. Nor is it to avoid high-pressure situations, which in most people's professional and personal lives is not realistic. The answer is to cultivate what the ancient Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom, the set of habits, frameworks, and dispositions that allow intelligence to function well even under the conditions that normally impair it. What follows is not a list of quick fixes. The patterns of failure we have examined are deeply embedded in cognitive architecture, reinforced by years of professional and social conditioning, and activated by the very conditions under which they are most difficult to counter. Genuine improvement requires sustained effort, the development of new habits of mind, and, perhaps most importantly, the cultivation of an honest and ongoing relationship with one's own limitations. Practice 1. Develop decision protocols ahead of time. The single most effective intervention for improving decision quality under pressure is to design decision protocols in advance, during periods of calm, and to commit to following those protocols even, especially, when the pressure to deviate from them is most intense. The power of pre-designed protocols is that they move the work of careful deliberation to conditions where deliberation is actually possible, before the pressure is on, before the cognitive resources needed for good analysis are depleted by stress, and before the emotional stakes of the specific decision have distorted the analytical frame. The military, aviation, medicine, and nuclear power industries have all developed extensive protocol systems for exactly this reason, because they have learned, often through catastrophic failures, that relying on real-time judgment alone in high-pressure situations is not sufficient, regardless of the quality of the people involved. Effective decision protocols for high-pressure situations include at minimum, clear criteria for what kinds of information must be gathered before a decision of a given type can be made, explicit requirements for seeking dissenting perspectives, prescribed time boundaries that prevent both premature closure and indefinite delay, and predefined escalation triggers that specify when a decision exceeds the authority of a given individual or group and must be referred upward. Crucially, protocols should include provisions specifically designed to counter the failure modes we have discussed. A protocol for making a major strategic decision, for example, might require that before the decision is made, the group must articulate the strongest case against the proposed course of action, not as a pro forma exercise, but as a genuine attempt to identify the most compelling reasons why the proposed course might be wrong. It might require that the views of the most junior members of the relevant group be solicited and recorded before the views of senior members are expressed. It might require a mandatory deliberation period even when the decision seems obvious, precisely because the feeling of obviousness is one of the warning signs of groupthink. Practice 2. Cultivate adversarial collaboration. One of the most effective structural interventions against the failure modes of intelligent decision-making is the deliberate institutionalization of adversarial collaboration, the systematic engagement of intelligent, credible people whose role is explicitly to challenge the dominant analysis and advocate for alternative conclusions. The value of adversarial collaboration, sometimes implemented as a devil's advocacy process, sometimes as a red team, blue team structure, sometimes as what the intelligence community calls alternative analysis, is that it externalizes the process of generating and entertaining dissenting views, removing it from the domain of individual psychological comfort and making it a structural feature of the decision process. For intelligent people, this kind of structural dissent serves a function that is psychologically difficult for individuals to perform internally. It provides permission to take seriously the possibility that the dominant analysis is wrong, without the social and identity costs that would normally attach to expressing that possibility. When the red team is wrong about everything and the dominant analysis turns out to be correct, the red team has still served its function by ensuring that the dominant analysis was genuinely tested rather than merely assumed. The implementation of adversarial collaboration requires care. Red teams that are routinely ignored, that are composed of lower status individuals whose challenges can be easily dismissed, or that are engaged at the end of a decision process rather than its beginning are worse than useless. They provide the illusion of challenge without its substance, creating false confidence that the dominant analysis has survived scrutiny when it has not. Effective adversarial collaboration requires that the challengers be sufficiently capable and credible that their challenges cannot be easily dismissed, that they be given access to the same information as the primary analysts, and that there be a genuine process for adjudicating between competing analyses rather than simply reverting to the judgment of the most senior person in the room. Practice 3. Manage cognitive load deliberately. Given what we know about how cognitive load and stress interact to impair decision-making, one of the most important investments that intelligent people can make is in systematic management of their cognitive load, especially in the run-up to high-stakes decision moments. Cognitive load management begins with the recognition that cognitive capacity is a finite resource that is depleted by use and restored by rest. This is not a metaphor, it is a neurobiological reality. The prefrontal cortex functions less effectively when fatigued, when nutritionally depleted, and when it has been engaged in sustained, effortful processing without recovery time. Leaders who make critical decisions at the end of 14-hour days, after weeks without adequate sleep, in organizational cultures that treat rest as a sign of weakness, are operating with significantly reduced decision capacity, regardless of how intelligent they are. A practical implication is that high-stakes decisions, when possible, should be scheduled for times of relative cognitive freshness, mornings for most people, times after adequate rest, times when the most cognitively demanding work of the day has not yet been done. When decisions cannot be scheduled, deliberate cognitive renewal strategies, brief periods of rest, movement, or disengagement from the immediate problem, can partially restore the prefrontal resources that deliberative decision-making requires. Cognitive load management also involves the deliberate simplification of decision environments in ways that reduce unnecessary complexity without eliminating necessary nuance. This means having clear organizational principles about what decisions require full deliberative process and which can be made through trusted heuristics, having well-maintained processes for distributing decision-making to appropriate levels of the organization rather than centralizing it in ways that overload senior decision-makers, and developing personal protocols for when to seek additional input and when to make a decision with available information. Practice 4. Develop emotional intelligence as a decision tool. Given the evidence that emotion is not separable from rational decision-making but is partially constitutive of it, the appropriate response to the problem of emotional hijacking is not the suppression of emotion but the development of what might be called emotional intelligence as a decision tool. The capacity to recognize, name, and appropriately incorporate one's emotional responses into the decision process, rather than either acting on them unreflectively or suppressing them at cognitive cost. This requires, first, the cultivation of emotional awareness, the ability to notice what one is feeling in real time, without the delay and distortion that characterizes most people's emotional processing. Research by Lisa Feldman Barrett and others suggests that emotional granularity, the ability to make fine-grained distinctions between different emotional states, is associated with better emotional regulation and better decision-making under stress. People who can tell the difference between anxiety and disgust, between frustration and grief, between excitement and fear, are better able to assess whether their emotional responses are signaling something relevant about the decision situation or generating noise from irrelevant associations. Second, it requires the development of specific protocols for noticing when emotional responses are likely to be distorting rather than informing judgment. Warning signs include strong conviction in the absence of clear evidence, the rapid generation of reasons to dismiss opposing views, a visceral negative reaction to people or information sources bearing inconvenient information, the sense that a decision is obvious when it was not obvious at the beginning of the process, and the feeling of pressure to commit before the analysis is complete. Third, it requires the cultivation of what the psychologist Ethan Kross calls psychological distancing, the ability to step back from the immediate emotional pressure of a situation and assess it with something closer to the perspective of an outside observer. Kross and colleagues have demonstrated that simple cognitive interventions, using one's own name in internal self-talk rather than the first person, imagining advising a friend in the same situation, explicitly adopting a future temporal perspective, in 5 years, what will I think of this decision, can measurably improve decision quality by creating cognitive and emotional distance from the immediate pressure of the situation. Practice 5. Build and honor dissent channels. The social dynamics that suppress dissent in intelligent group decision environments, the status hierarchies, the information cascades, the groupthink dynamics, cannot be countered by exhortation alone. Simply telling people to speak up will not change behavior that is shaped by deep social structures and powerful psychological forces. What is required are structural interventions that make dissent easier, safer, and more consequential. Effective dissent channels take many forms. The most powerful is the explicit designation of a dissent role, devil's advocate, red team lead, official skeptic, that gives social permission for the expression of contrary views. When someone is appointed to the role of challenger, their challenges are heard as professional role fulfillment rather than personal disloyalty or intellectual inadequacy, which dramatically reduces the social cost of the dissenting view and increases the likelihood that it will be expressed fully and honestly. Anonymous input mechanisms, surveys, suggestion systems, or processes that allow people to register concerns without being identified, can also surface important dissenting views that would otherwise be suppressed by social dynamics. These mechanisms are most useful for gathering the initial input that reveals what concerns are present in the group. They need to be paired with open processes for discussing and adjudicating those concerns in order to be genuinely useful. The most important structural change, and the most difficult to implement, is the modification of the norms by which leaders respond to dissent. If leaders respond to challenges with defensive dismissal, social punishment, or the implication that the challenger doesn't understand the situation, they will have no shortage of sycophants but will be systematically deprived of the critical input they most need. If they respond to well-reasoned dissent with genuine engagement, with evident appreciation for the contribution to their thinking, and with demonstrated willingness to update their positions when the argument warrants it, they create the conditions in which the flow of information to decision makers is not filtered by the political dynamics of who will be punished for saying what. Practice 6. Cultivate intellectual humility as a professional practice. Intellectual humility, the disposition to hold one's beliefs with appropriate tentativeness, to update them readily in response to evidence, and to take seriously the possibility that one is wrong, is the meta-virtue that makes all the other practices possible. Without it, decision protocols become rubber stamps for predetermined conclusions, adversarial collaboration becomes theater, emotional awareness becomes sophisticated rationalization, and dissent channels remain unused. For intelligent, high-achieving people, intellectual humility is often in tension with the professional culture they inhabit and the identity they have constructed. In many elite professional environments, expressing genuine uncertainty is perceived as weakness, updating one's position in response to others' arguments is perceived as inconsistency, acknowledging error is perceived as a career liability. The cultivation of intellectual humility requires operating against these cultural pressures, and it is genuinely difficult. What makes it achievable is the recognition that intellectual humility is not the abandonment of conviction. It is the capacity to hold conviction and tentativeness simultaneously, to be willing to act decisively on one's best current judgment while remaining genuinely open to evidence that it is wrong. The most intellectually humble people I have encountered are not the most tentative or indecisive. They are among the most decisive, because their decisions are made from a clear-eyed assessment of what is actually known, rather than a defensive posture that must maintain the appearance of certainty at the cost of honest engagement with the situation. Developing intellectual humility as a professional practice means keeping records of one's predictions and assessments and reviewing their accuracy regularly, what Philip Tetlock and Barbara Mellers have called calibration training. It means actively seeking out people who hold well-reasoned views different from one's own and engaging with those views seriously. It means practicing the habit of articulating the strongest version of opposing arguments before attempting to rebut them, what philosophers call the steel man, rather than the straw man. And it means developing the courage to say, in the most public contexts, the three words that intelligent people most often find it hardest to say: I was wrong. Practice 7. Recognize and name the pressure signals. A final practice, foundational to all the others, is the development of the ability to recognize, in real time, not only in retrospect, the conditions under which the failure modes we have examined are most likely to operate. This is a form of metacognitive skill, the ability to monitor not just the object of one's thinking, the decision at hand, but the process of one's thinking and its vulnerabilities in the current moment. The warning signs that intelligent minds are beginning to operate in their characteristic failure modes are recognizable once you know what to look for. The feeling of sudden clarity in the midst of a complex situation is a warning sign. Real clarity in complex situations is earned slowly, not generated instantaneously. The sense that dissenters simply don't understand is a warning sign. It may be true, but it should prompt inquiry rather than dismissal. The growing conviction that a decision must be made right now is a warning sign. Often, what feels like genuine urgency is manufactured by the pressure itself rather than by the actual requirements of the situation. The absence of disagreement in a group of intelligent people is a warning sign. It almost certainly means that disagreement is being suppressed rather than that genuine consensus has been achieved. Learning to recognize these signals requires practice. The kind of practice that comes from sustained reflection on one's own decision history, from honest post-mortems of both successes and failures, and from the cultivated habit of stepping back from the immediacy of the situation to ask, what kind of moment is this? What cognitive failure modes are most likely active? What do I need to do differently here from what my instincts are telling me? This is the work of wisdom, and it is genuinely difficult. It runs against the grain of the urgency that high-pressure situations generate. It requires the willingness to slow down precisely when everything is screaming to speed up. It requires the humility to doubt one's own judgment precisely when one's confidence is at its highest. It is, in short, the opposite of everything that intelligence under pressure naturally produces. Which is exactly why it has to be cultivated deliberately, practiced consistently, and protected institutionally. Not because it is easy, but because the alternative, the brilliant mind unguided by wisdom, operating at full power in the high-pressure moments that matter most, is the cause of some of the most consequential failures in human history. Epilogue. The wisest thing a smart person can do. In the Greek tradition, wisdom was distinguished from intelligence as a separate and higher cognitive virtue. Intelligence, nous, was the capacity for swift, accurate cognition. Wisdom, Sophia and phronesis, was the capacity to apply cognition well, to know when to think slowly and when to act quickly, when to trust one's expertise and when to question it, when to lead boldly and when to listen carefully. Intelligence was a necessary but not sufficient condition for wisdom. And wisdom, not intelligence, was held to be the virtue that made a person genuinely useful to themselves and others. The research and reflection that has occupied the preceding chapters suggests that the ancient Greeks were onto something important, that intelligence without wisdom is not neutral, but actively dangerous. That the most capable minds, under the conditions of high pressure and high stakes that attend the decisions that matter most, are capable of the most systematic and consequential errors. And that the path from brilliant failure to genuine wisdom requires not the suppression of intelligence but its humbling, the cultivation of a relationship with one's own cognitive limits that is honest enough to catch the failure modes before they produce their characteristic catastrophes. I want to close with a thought about what this means for intelligent people in their daily lives. The research I have described should not be read as a counsel of self-doubt or as an argument against the exercise of judgment and leadership. The world needs people who can think clearly, decide boldly, and act with conviction. The failures we have examined were not produced by excessive confidence, excessive ambition, or excessive intelligence. They were produced by the failure to pair those capacities with the wisdom that makes them genuinely valuable. The wisest thing a smart person can do is not to trust their intelligence less. It is to understand their intelligence more completely, to know not just what it can do, but what it cannot, not just where it excels, but where it systematically errs, not just how it functions at its best, but how it fails at its worst. This knowledge, applied honestly and consistently, is what transforms raw intelligence into genuine wisdom. It is also what distinguishes the leaders who navigate high-pressure crises with grace and judgment from those who make the kind of brilliant, catastrophic decisions that fill the historical record. The former are not less intelligent than the latter. They have simply learned something that is not taught in any curriculum but is available to anyone willing to look honestly at the limits of their own mind. That intelligence, like any powerful tool, is most dangerous when its possessor is least aware of its limitations. The capacity for that honest awareness, for the intellectual courage to look unflinchingly at how one's own cognition can mislead, is the rarest and most valuable cognitive virtue. It is not given by intelligence. It is earned through the practice of wisdom. And it is, in the end, what separates the brilliant decisions from the brilliant failures.